My lecture is titled Revisiting the Legacies of Syed Ahmed Khan, a modernist Indian Muslim reformer. And, you know, I'm going to actually not start with Syed Ahmed Khan, I'm going to end with him. I'm going to start with the matter at hand, the Protestant Reformation. And I just want to say that my remarks and observations are exploratory in the spirit of reflection and stock-taking. The first thing that I'd like to say is that Luther's theology, to my mind, primarily was concerned with the vertical relationship between the believer and God. He sought to reframe or recast the relationship between the believer and God from a kind of contractual basis to a non-contractual basis. In so doing, he was critiquing the Catholic Church's rendering the sale of indulgences prominent in the relationship between believer and God. He was critiquing that. So he went from kind of a quid pro quo relationship that was there with the Catholic Church to a non-quid pro quo relationship. One could argue that Luther's central theological premise of justification by faith was really about what might be termed a pure theology of gift. He was in effect saying that the primary ingredient in that relationship between the believer and God ought to be faith, that faith is a divine gift, the giver of the gift is God, and hence, from that flows salvation. You can see I'm taking a completely different tack than some of my previous colleagues who focused more on textual criticism. I'm actually going to put a spotlight on theology. Where am I going with this? Well, in a paradoxical way, Luther's Reformation brought Christianity closer to Islam. And in fact, a number of scholars have made comparisons between, for example, Sunni Islam on the one hand and Protestant denominations. They've also made comparisons between Shia Islam and Catholicism. If one distills Luther's theology of the gift to 5 elements, and they all interconnect: sola scriptura, scripture alone; sola fide, faith alone; sola gratia, grace alone; solus Deus and solus Christus, God alone and Christ alone. The only disagreement that Islam has with these 5 is in solus Christus. All of the other 4, they line up with Islam, at least Sunni Islam, very, very nicely. Indeed, actually, the first article of belief in Islam is the Shahada. And that is a profession of faith. I bear witness that there's no God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. That's an article of faith, and it is essentially the creedal definition of Islam. Even if one focuses on the very term Islam, what that name means, one discerns the commonalities between Islam, mainly its Sunni variety, and Protestant Christianity, but really Islam and Christianity, period. Because in my estimation, the term Islam is often wrongfully construed in the West as submission or surrender to God. And in the Western kind of imaginary, that comes off as slavish submission or slavish adherence to the one God. Really, what Islam, in the sense of surrender and submission, means is having one's own will replaced by the will of God. And that actually also lines up very, very nicely with Luther's central theological premise of justification by faith alone. Sola scriptura. I needn't say much about that because Islam is a paradigmatically scriptural religion, if nothing else. So there too, both with regard to the centrality of Scripture in the faith relation between believer and God and the dissemination of Scripture, we see that there are parallels between the Reformation that Luther effected and Islam. Now, from there, I want to move on to really kind of nodding toward the second half of our conference, which is putting the words Reformation and Islam together. And here, what I'd like to say is that unlike what I see to be the primary focus on the vertical relationship between believer and God, with which Luther started. And I'm not saying that social relations were not a concern of his, or the transformation of the social was not a concern. But unlike that central vertical relation on which he focused in his theological critique of the Catholic Church, I think it's possible to envision Reformation, recasting, reinvention in Islam with regard to horizontal relations, social relations. Where reinvention, recasting, and Reformation in the Islamic spectrum is needed is with regard to what I would term self and other relations. Relations and interactions between Muslims on the one hand and non-Muslims on the other hand. I mean this both with regard to, for example, minority communities of Muslims living in the West and their relationship with non-Muslims in the West, be it Europe or the United States, but also minority non-Muslim communities such as the Copts and others living in Muslim-dominant cultures and the relations between those two groups. So one could say that arguably, unlike the Protestant Reformation, which at least in its theological inception laid stress on the vertical relationship between the believer and God, Reformation in Islam has to engage issues of religious pluralism. I might add that also, I think this focus on horizontal relations and their recasting within and around Muslim communities should and ought also to concern intra-religious dimensions. So, for example, relations and the lack of or tensions and conflicts between various sects and denominations within the larger Islamic community. That's where Syed Ahmed Khan comes into the picture. Because to effect that kind of recasting and reinvention of horizontal, lateral relations between different constituencies as far as Islam and Muslims is concerned, a theological toolkit is essential. I think one of the really exciting things for me in engaging with the Protestant Reformation is to see that theology matters. We can belittle theology in all sorts of ways. The popular culture may, even in the academy, theology is often sidelined. But the fact of the matter is that Luther was a theologian. Luther was an academic theologian. He started with theology, he ended with theology. And even if we're thinking about something as off to the side as the social domain, the domain of human relationships, theology is I think, can be transformative. Syed Ahmed Khan was born in 1817, died in 1898. He was born in northern India. He was born in Delhi. He lived within the shadow of the British colonial empire, and he was very, very much affected by this. In fact, one of his most famous tracts or treatises was a critique of the British India Company right after the rebellion of 1857. This rebellion, often glossed in British history as the Mutiny of 1857, was so very important that what was brought in was the decline of the colonial grip in British India. Syed Ahmed Khan authored a tract entitled Causes of the Indian Rebellion. He delved into politics, he wrote on art history, he published religious history, he published exegeses. He was a very generative thinker, very generative and very kind of varied thinker, elastic thinker. The other thing that he's really known for in the Muslim world, particularly South Asia, is his founding of Aligarh University. That university still exists in Delhi. And it's kind of, it's a little amusing. He founded, the idea of establishing this university came to him after he visited the UK in the late 1860s. He was so impressed with what he saw, he said, I'm going to go back and found a Muslim Cambridge. And so this is how he styled it. You can see from this that one can perhaps even think of Syed Ahmed Khan as kind of a British apologist, right? I don't think so. I mean, I think the fact that he published this searing critique of the British India's policies, I think it's much more important to see him as a more complex figure. Now, why is Syed Ahmed Khan important regarding a theological toolkit? Well, because I see his writings and his work as setting forth three theologies that I think are important to take up and that may provide some of the theological tools by which Muslims can think about recasting, reinvention, reformation with regard to some of the problems they face. They are, first, a theology of scriptural pluralism, and here I doff my hat to my colleague, Tammy Schneider. Syed Ahmed Khan, back in the mid-19th century, was already thinking of scriptural pluralism. And one of the things he argued is that the canonized scriptures of Jews and Christians, namely the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, should be accepted as they are. As it stands in traditional Islam, they're not accepted. Even though Islam and the Quran pays tribute to the biblical prophets, even though the ideal forms of the Torah and gospel are recognized, the codified, canonized current scriptures of Jews and Christians are not accepted because they're deemed to be corrupted. Syed Ahmed Khan argued, let's get over that. Let's look at what unites these scriptures, that is to say, Tawheed. Tawheed, the belief in one God. And he argued that really those scriptures should be embraced by Muslims as valid, legitimate scriptures. This is quite radical. And to put action to his words, he's one of the few Muslims that wrote an exegesis on the first book of the Hebrew Bible and the first part of the New Testament, namely the Gospels. Okay? Second theology that I think is really, really innovative, a theology of dynamic prophecy. Syed Ahmed Khan argued that not only is prophecy continuous, but that prophecy is, he humanized and naturalized prophecy. He argued, first of all, that every human being is born with kind of an inborn faculty for prophecy, but that in only a few does it get nurtured and cultivated and activated. He also argued that prophecy is continuous. Syed Ahmed Khan regarded the Prophet Muhammad as a unique paradigm. He suggested that there will be no figure like Muhammad after Muhammad, but that God's communication with humanity continues. And I think the reason this is really informative and interesting is because the idea of prophecy continuous, the idea of a dynamic prophecy, is also suggestive of a dynamic canon. And I think Muslims can do more with the notion of a dynamic canon, possibly a supplementary canon to the Quran that allows for vexing and troubling issues to be addressed. The third theology, and then I'm going to wrap it up, is a theology of wonder and awe in nature. Syed Ahmed Khan was really fascinating in the sense that he pointed toward a deeply embedded phenomenology in the Quran, which engages what might be called the signs of nature. And Muslims are very conversant with this. They know about the signs of nature that are pointed out in the Quran, everything from the alternation of night and day to the seasons, et cetera, et cetera. Syed Ahmed Khan underscored how this evocation of wonder and awe in the beholder, in the believer, was a testament to both the mercy and the power of God. In fact, this particular element of Syed Ahmed Khan's theology harks back to the Prophet Muhammad's hadith that the whole of the earth is a mosque. I find this really fascinating, not only because it applies to humanity in general, but because it could be used toward a very, very powerful ethic of environmentalism, given the state of the shape our planet is in. And I think I'm going to wrap it up at that and suggest that these three theologies by Syed Ahmed Khan, perhaps it is in the realm of Islam in the West, Islam in the United States, that these three theologies can be taken up and engaged with to troubleshoot some of the problems. Thank you.